All right, welcome, divas and dudes. So exciting to have you guys here at Paris Bakery. We are continuing with our food additives, and I picked an additive that I think is you're going to quickly find even probably more curious because it's not actually an additive. So, has anybody heard of acrylamide? Yes, some yeses, some no's. Okay, good. A lot of no's. Um, Most of you know I'm from California, and of course, leave it to California to always kind of be cutting edge, both good and bad. So in California, there is a Prop 65 that is kind of put this one probably on the table, if you will, because of its fear of causing cancer. And so California is really conservative in that anything that has a risk, they're going to want the public to know about it, which I think is a good thing. But interesting that this particular food ingredient is not like other additives because it's something that already occurs in foods. It actually is created in foods. And so I'm going to take you through some pictures, if you can see my little slides. Who doesn't love grilled food? Everybody loves grilled food, right? And if you've sat down with me, I become really unpopular when I say, as part of your anti-cancer way of life, you want to cut down on grilled foods. And anybody that was smiling before I said that starts to not smile anymore and think, what is this girl talking about? This California girl that knows nothing about Texas. And part of the reason around avoiding grilled foods is because of the chemicals that are made when we have high temperature cooking. So acrylamide is one of these chemicals that starts to develop at high heat temperatures. And so that's really what I want to talk about today. So the good news is that it's not only in meat. So really it's actually the starch foods that are most significant in producing acrylamide. So what we're going to talk about a lot today is when we go to your best foods list and we look at foods that we want to put on your proteins and your carbohydrates and your fats, that's going to be important. But the other piece of that best foods list that we always bring up is sort of the tools around the best foods list. Can you think of what those are? The portions, right? The company that the food keeps. Here's the smoking gun. Yes, the cooking method. And of course, when we think of portion and company and cooking, we also think of the quality of the ingredient. So in the last several weeks, we've been really kind of focusing on the quality of the ingredient, and probably some of the takeaways that you've had so far is junk food, highly processed foods are going to have some of the food colorings that we don't want, some of the preservatives, the MSG. We've talked about fermented foods, and that's a really great way of preserving. And I have my my chow chow, and you guys, it turned out so good. Anybody at my chow chow class?
Yeah, it's really hard.
Oh my gosh, I've been so excited. So you're gonna see it, and we're gonna have samples of it, and I'm just so excited. It turned out fantastic. So I've just now launched into the whole world of fermenting. And when you think about it, fermenting was a technique to add flavor, add pizzazz, of course, add preservation. And so we know that when foods are combined in certain ways, it creates chemicals. Some good, some not good. And so this acrylamide kind of falls into that category. And if you can see my picture here, it's showing fried foods. And do you see the skull and crossbones? It kind of cracks me up. Skull and crossbones. Can you tell what that's on? Toast. And right? I know, burnt toast. I know. The other thing, and I have a picture later, is coffee. So coffee beans were sort of the culprit that became an issue in California on Prop 65, because the coffee stores with more than, it's like 10 employees and higher, they were required to make notes to their guests that they have products that contain acrylamide. So the roasted coffee beans are now a source of this chemical. And so, then we have to wonder, well, what else could it be in? Here we've got toast and we've got coffee. Those are like the most simple and beautiful ingredients. That's what I have every morning for breakfast. And so that's what I kind of wanted to look through. Even grilling of vegetables are now going to be of question because of what's happening on that surface. So what's that? I know, right?
I was going to say, for the record, I'm not giving up my coffee. The line's got to be drawn somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the good news is, I'm just going to cut to the chase. The good news, I'm not going to suggest you give up coffee, and definitely not toast, but we always talk about how to minimize our risk of exposure to carcinogens. And that's what this is always about, and even though I would love to say it's okay to eat bacon once in a while, I don't think I could quite step over that boundary. I know. But the reality is, if that's a food you love and you're going to cut out your carcinogens in other areas, go for it, because we know plenty of anecdotal evidence that says bacon is not going to cause cancer, right? Now, which lifestyle habits are we pretty sure does cause cancer? Smoking, right? We can say without much equivocation that smoking is directly linked to, deadly diseases. And of course, cigarettes are one of the highest sources of acrylamide. Right? So how can we compare coffee to cigarettes? Except some people do them together, right? So what's important is that our environment is going to have exposures to chemicals. So what we do is we just minimize our risk. And this is a slide that I think is kind of interesting for the science buffs, but not for anybody else probably. Really what this is showing is the reaction that gives us this chemical called acrylamide. And in case you can't see it, it's really looking at sugar and the amino acid asparagine come together to form this chemical that in very large doses has caused cancer in rats. We haven't been able to ever point to it causing cancer in humans. Now, again, we know that we aren't like rats, except we have some similarities. We're, at least both mammals. But when we start seeing some correlation, that's when very, cautious governments want to put up that risk so that at least, buyer beware, which I appreciate. But, some folks that don't want Prop 65 to continue, their perspective is that you're causing undue fear for people because A, we can't prove a direct correlation. B, do we know that there's a certain level in foods, and how many other factors are going to be involved in this cancer risk? Is it just having coffee and burnt toast? And so, I think that they've got a point on both sides. If we see some risk, we want buyer to beware. We can think of other foods like that, right? Even the red dye, we had correlation to thyroid cancer. But are we able to unequivocally say that a certain level of red dye number 40 would cause it? We can't say that. So, with a lot of unknowns, of course, the food industry and Starbucks is going to say, no, do not scare my public, and so there's definitely a catch-22 there. But needless to say, asparagine is an amino acid. What else do we know of that comes from an amino acid that now is in question, and it sweetens some people's coffee and it's in a blue package? Yeah, equal. Yeah, it's 2 amino acids that are chemically changed. And so, yeah, it's just amazing to me that proteins can do that. But proteins are so versatile. So cooking foods at high temperatures, grilling, barbecuing, frying, sauteing, and broiling produce the compounds, the heterocyclic amines, and the advanced glycation end products. So, short end of it is that when things are cooked at high temperatures, we start seeing this issue. And so the nice thing is there's so much option. For starters, we don't have to use such high temperatures. Even if you're barbecuing, what would be some options to sort of protect the food? Any thoughts? Yes. Oh my gosh. Exactly. So protecting it, and that's in my next slide, girl. You saw my notes. But yeah, so even before we marinate it, we could also say start the cooking with your barbecue and then finish it in the oven, or vice versa. Start it in the oven, finish it on the barbecue. What we really don't like is slow, long, steady cooking, like Rudy's, any barbecue place is. And so what it made me think of right away was the poor people that work in barbecue places. Imagine how much they're ingesting day after day after day. And in fact, any of the research that they're looking at for acrylamide, it is usually when there's a person that has been exposed to it, is from their work site. Acrylamide is found in plants that produce paper, textiles, contact lenses, all this industry. So the fact that our food creates it is kind of interesting, that our food could do it. But of course, our food is in fact a chemical soup. So, when you think of it that way, you realize that it's why wouldn't it be possible? So potatoes, nuts, beans, legumes, anything that's roasted or cooked at high temperatures has the risk of developing this chemical. And I don't want you to try to read this, but this is the study that I kind of showed to explain that all this research, when it looks at the reaction of acrylamide in physiology, is based on this blue rat. So they progressively give the rat more and more of a chemical to see how much does it take for him to have a reaction. And so that's the case with the non-nutritives as well as, of course, the acrylamide. We haven't done it at all on humans yet, fortunately. And so, I don't ever see us really doing that. So the only way we really have to study chemicals like this is looking at environments, people groups, and trying to deduce, if people eat this seems to happen more. And of course, that's why it's so tough to actually do. But to Maria's point, what can we do to help protect the food? Well, the good news is there's a lot we could do. Marinating is a great example. And again, just like in our own bodies, we have antioxidants that help protect our exposure to free radicals. So when you do this to your foods, it also helps to prevent exposure to free radicals. How crazy is that? So you see this beautiful picture of the antioxidant spices. And I just love this picture because you can see all the bright colors. Turmeric, smoked paprika, all of the bright reds, so chilies, and even herbs help to protect the product. So whether we're cooking vegetables or meats, the nice thing is we're able to protect it in that way. And of course, the marinades, when you pick key marinades, including rosemary and olive oil, and even vinegars, you're protecting the surface of your product. So I was so excited to see that. Of course, there's more ways, right? So if we think of marinade, and we think of adding spices, we're going to think of pre-cooking our products and then grilling quickly. So, like in restaurants, if you ever notice they have the beautiful grill marks in the steak or the chicken, we do that with our beet burgers. So I heat up my cast iron skillet really high, I flash it in the pan to get the pretty marks, and then I finish it in the oven. Doable. So I'm really exposing it to that potential buildup of chemical for about 3 minutes rather than the 14 minutes that it takes to cook. So pre-cooking, and then less time with high heat. marinades. But now, what else could we do to make the food easier to digest and have less chemicals? Well, how about steam and boil? For sure, that makes it easier, right? Because now water is the medium, so it's protecting it. Now, we can also do some great flavors when we do steam and boil. You guys were here, some of you were here when I did the asparagus. And we did sort of this fusion of cooking, right? So you could do that with flavors, you could do it with heat, and you can have a blend of moist heat and dry heat. So you heat up your skillet to make it really hot, and then you add in your product to a dry skillet, and then turn down the heat and add your oil on top. So again, that's protecting it. Of course, you could add in your oil and then the food, but make sure that skillet's already nice and hot. So pre-cooking also can be like preheating. So you're getting as little time in that skillet as possible. Preheating now makes it fast and effective, in and out as quickly as you can. The other thing is preheating, adding your spices and marinades, and then turning the heat way down. Adding the water now helps to stop that acrylamide development because now you're boiling/steaming. So there's lots of fun cooking methods that will help us cut down on that just a bit. So when I think of, that's all my fun slides. When I think of some food variations, now what I want us to do is go back to my best foods list thought process and really help you think of how we're going to maximize our best foods, and know that acrylamide is going to be existing in foods that are already packaged, right? Because when the food companies make their stuff, are they worried about chemicals building up in their foods? Definitely not. So what, just in general, what foods on the shelves do you think we're going to be highest in high heat damage? Yes. 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 What a good point. Best foods and then foods to avoid. So here's an interesting one. A couple of companies that make potato chips and French fries have agreed to purposefully lower their acrylamide content. And they won't tell how they're doing that. I tried to search it, and they won't really give up their secrets. You know, like I just mentioned, our techniques of, you know, partially cooking or finishing it off in the oven. So my hunch is that they're doing something like that. But it could be even as simple as cutting the French fries fatter, because now there's less chance of it burning and getting yummy and crispy, right, on the edges, and still getting the full cooked process accomplished. So French fries and potato chips. Now, what do you think about the potato chips that aren't deep fried, they're baked? Would that be better? Baked, not fried? What's that? Yeah, exactly. I love how you're thinking, Rachel. Yeah, because just like I kind of alluded to, they didn't tell us how. If now we're advertising that we're doing baked, not fried, we're trying to think of, gosh, it's kind of living under the halo of healthy because everything is better baked. Not necessarily. So what other products can you think of that you might get from the freezer that we're trying to be healthy with? It would be things like Alexa's sweet potato fries, you know, where they've already been pretty heavily preserved, pre-cooked. They might be cut thicker. They might be using olive oil, but then what do you have to do to them? Well, you're going to put them in your oven, and the oil that's impregnated on the French fry is still going to go to pretty high heat. Now, if we did those on our own, could we make that better? So I would say yes. So home fries, what we could do is have a little thicker cut. Now, we know that acrylamide is going to happen even if we buy the very best organic sweet potatoes. It's just part of the process of the chemistry, right? So it's not going to really help us to get the expensive organics to cut down on acrylamide. But if we did buy the organic and kept the skin on, and we used organic spices, are we now getting more antioxidant exposure to that veggie? I would say yes. So good quality ingredient. That means we're getting more antioxidants. So if those French fries are cut at 4 o'clock and you add your red spice and your olive oil and you cook them in your air fryer at 4:30, the amount of breakdown of your vitamin C and your beta carotene is so much less. So that means the veggie has so much more bang for your buck than if you bought the Alexas, right? Who is still going to have the same amount of acrylamide perhaps because you're going to cook it in your oven. But yours has a lot more antioxidants. It's a fresher product. You see where I'm going with this? So the quality of the ingredient, yes, we can do some variations, but getting really good quality and cooking them at home is always going to give you a better antioxidant push than the pre-processed. What about, have you guys ever heard, I'm sure you haven't, silly me, nobody knows about Little Debbie's in here, right? I see eyebrows going up. I know. I only know the brand because I think of Hostess Twinkies. Those are the ones I know, right? Yes, and Tasty Cakes. So those would probably be the epitome of what you don't want on your best foods list, because not only are they picking ingredients that are really poor quality, but it's one step on top of the other of, gosh, bad choice, right? The worst oils you can think of to cook in, and loaded with sugar. And we know that the reaction is sugar plus an amino acid causes acrylamide. So, it just layer on top of layer of why we wouldn't want to pick that. And so that's kind of the purpose of this whole discussion is not so much the acrylamide itself, because we know that's going to occur in cooking starchy foods, even some meat foods. Probably the meats even less, which now gives you 1+ for going back to having a little barbecue steak or chicken on your barbecue, because really it's the starchy foods that have that really high risk of the sugar turnover. But we know that we're going to avoid processed foods that give us the most value. What about some other items? Can you think of anything on the avoids list? Here we are back to the foods. So anytime there's a bacon that has been cured in maple syrup, bacon with maple syrup. I know, anything that's got sugar plus amino acids. So sugar with amino acids increases the chance of the acrylamide development. And so, that's why oftentimes I try to encourage folks to think of it as a bigger picture. It's not quite as simple when you're trying to create your anti-cancer way of life. It's not quite so simple to say, well, I'm just going to eat more spinach and I'm going to cut out Twinkies. Right? It's starting to really think about all the layers of where you can add in good quality antioxidants and where you could take out potential carcinogens by deselecting some foods. And so we just get to a little deeper conversation. One of the ones that I was kind of sad about is on the avoids is roasted nuts. Right? Yeah. Right? So now, how do we break down going from good to great? We're always going to say that it's still great to choose nuts, even if they're pre-roasted and even if they have, something yummy on it, if they're honeyed or carameled or something like that. It's still going to be better than a Little Debbie's. We'll just definitely say that. But if you love the flavor of different salts and maybe even some sweets added to a nut, how could we do it on our own?
I buy the raw cashews and I put stuff on it.
Yes! That's brilliant. That's it.
Yeah.
So these can go over here by, roasting your own. There are some great YouTube discussions about air fryers, and do air fryers exacerbate the acrylamide production? And it's so fun to watch. As soon as you start going down these bunny trails, you realize that there's so many discussions on both sides of the fence. And so this is not even that new of information. The acrylamide discussion really started about 7 years ago. And so, it's been churning in the Reddit and YouTube and all the social interchanges with people. And so most of them will again say that the time that it's in a high cooking temperature is critical, as well as the quality of the ingredient that you're using. But I totally agree with you, Anita, that if you buy your own, if you get organic, you're going to pay quite a bit more, but that's one choice, especially with cashews. And if you, buy them raw, you know that you've got to get them fresh, because sometimes if raw sits too long, there's a chance that there could be a fungus that develops, right? So you just have to find a good vendor to be able to do that. Something else that I think is a little bit interesting is when you think about the pesticides and herbicides that are on products. I'm doing a little bit of research for our next topic, which is just that. And something that really surprised me was a couple of the grains that are on the top of the list of having high residue of pesticides. And who would have thought it was oats? Did not know that. So now, say we are trying to use oats and we're inadvertently getting a high pesticide residue, and we are making cookies in our air fryer and we're taking out all the sugar, but now we've got acrylamide buildup on top of the potential pesticides. That's making us think twice. We've taken out the sugar, we're trying to do a really healthy product, and we're going to use organic maple syrup, and then we have pesticides and herbicides that are quite high, and then we're trying to cook these oats, and oats are a really high risk of acrylamide. When I first heard of acrylamide as a potential toxin in foods, it was from Cheerios. They were really on the bad list. So, when we think of, I'll start going from the top down again, breakfast cereals, a lot of them use oats. And so oats are one of those real tricky foods, because the way that the crops are harvested, they use a product like Roundup, and they put it all across the field in order to dry it out and easier to reap the oats. But of course, now you've got this bad chemical on your oats. So now you get a double whammy of so much of the residue that you have during the growing of the crop, and then of the cooking process is the other issue, where now we're having some breakdown of the product. So the more we can start learning about which ones to pick, and then thinking about layers of options to help improve, I think it's going to really be our best bet. Several of the other grains have the same idea, where the crops are handled not so well in the goal of trying to really get the crops to market. So in general, roasting your nuts, you can absolutely get almonds, and don't chop them first. You could dip them in a little bit of some oil that is going to maintain its quality at higher temperatures, which would be, anybody guess? Coconut oil or palm. Those two oils can tolerate a higher heat. So again, we're going to protect the nut. And then you could put your sweetener or your salt after you cook it. So again, when you have your nuts and you bring them onto this side, roast them with a good quality oil that can sustain a high temperature, and then add whatever, if you did cinnamon or you did salt or you did turmeric mixed with maple syrup. Those are all great ways to season the nuts. If you just want them plain, I would still recommend put a little oil on them, roast them whole. So again, that's protecting the surface area of the nut. So I'd always want you to pick whole nuts over the ones that are chopped or sliced or slivered, and that way you're minimizing the exposure of its surface area to that acrylamide production. Okay? I know, right? So much.
Suzanne, I have a question about California and cacao powder.
Yes.
So I have noticed over the years, because that's one of my favorite breakfast drinks, is the cacao.
Yes.
And certain packages will say California, will say it's something about this could cause cancer.
Is part of that same Prop 65. And so what happens is, and once you know about this now and you can start looking at this regulation, it's again very debated, because as soon as there's even a question of the ingredient, the chemical, it gets under this umbrella. And so the food companies and, you know, the watchdog environmentalists are really against how to manage this. And so I don't know about cacao in particular. Do you know of any of the details? Is there a chemical in there that we're worried about?
I have asked, because I have tried different companies, Navitas. I'll
Yes.
look to see, like, if it's coming from California,
Yes.
then it'll say it. But if it's coming from somewhere else, it may not have it. So I asked Cost Plus Nutrition one time. I said, hey, like, should I buy yours or like what you have in the store?
Yes.
And they just said, it just depends on how it's being processed. I didn't get like a real clear answer, but you know what I mean. I do look at the back of the package.
So I'm glad. And so he's saying how it's processed, which I believe, because remember, cacao is just like coffee. It's a roasted bean. And so it's in the same category as the roasting of beans that for coffee. So when it's roasted for different levels, when you think about this, the cacao is a dark chocolate. There's a lot of oils in it. So it's going to follow the same process of coffee. If you have a dark roast, bean of coffee or bean of chocolate, it's actually in the roaster less time. So dark roast has less acrylamide, we'll just say chemical, right? And a light roast, so like the milk chocolates, same thing, is going to have more of the acrylamide. Right? So it kind of is maybe counterintuitive, but also there's more caffeine in the light roast, and that's because the bean has just been broken down more. If you look at the pictures of beans, the dark roast is a very dark color. The light roast has been cooked a lot more, and so it's just had more time to that temperature exposure. And so I'm guessing that the cacao is the same idea. Okay. What else? Other questions?
Google machine, tolerable, whatever that means, intake of acrylamide should be at 2.6 micrograms per kilogram. So for a 150-pound person, that's like 180 micrograms.
180 micrograms.
According to the interwebs, yeah. My coffee's 0.45.
Safe intake. And your coffee is 4.5?
0.45.
Oh, is that what it told you?
Yeah, but get this. Compare this to the 40 to 82 micrograms of acrylamide that you find in the average fast food French fries.
Okay, say that again. Fast food?
French fries are 40 to 80 micrograms, so half your daily
micrograms. Right. And see, so this is kind of like the safe intake. Remember, we talked about that in our last right. Nobody gets to know these things. And there is a picture that I pulled up. So I'm glad you're looking at this, Ben, because what was in my other slide, looking at foods and how they kind of add up. So pull out another one. If this is fast food French fries, what about toast? Toast was one of the hot topics on these different sites. And, that's why I pulled up a picture of, how light of your toast do you have to have in order for it to be safe? And, it's funny that you start to really look at that. But if we looked at a white toast versus a multigrain or a sprouted, excuse me, what would be the benefits? If it's white bread, it's going to have a higher sugar content, so the chances of there being a greater transition to the acrylamide is higher, and it has less antioxidants and less fiber and less protein and all those other values.
5 micrograms.
5 micrograms. Thank you for that. So if we're looking at 180 as our safe intake, it starts to add up and still very low. And again, just to reiterate, the American Cancer Society says there's no correlation that they can be conclusive on of acrylamide and a cancer. In fact, here's another fun piece of tidbit of information. Coffee is actually associated with, excuse me, with lower incidence of cancer. When we try to identify specific foods, we see some really interesting things. Like you might have heard that coffee, might not have heard this one, but coffee is correlated with lowering your risk of Parkinson's. So that one's fun. This one was specific of lower incidence of kidney, prostate, and breast cancer. People that drank this, even wine, it was a fun one. Wine and coffee as well lower cancer risk in certain cancers. When we look at people that eat fast food, of course, we can see lots of correlation. We can't necessarily say that their risk is higher because of the chemicals in the foods. Instead, we point to what? The obesity and the clogging of their arteries and their diabetes. And so it starts to be very muddy to be able to identify what's causing the actual problem. Is it little hits of different chemicals? But so often we want to know why did we get cancer? And it's just going to be so difficult to be able to pinpoint. And so I always go back to the goal of minimizing our risk and making sure that we do what we can to have really healthy foods going into our system. And restaurants and grocery stores are typically not the place that's going to help us do that. And that's why cooking at home is going to, be our best bet. When we were looking at the fermented foods, we were thinking about adding sugar and salt to that, whole mixture of vegetables. We could even do a step up from that and use an all-natural sugar if we were worried about the white refined sugar. Because I was reading in one of the articles that even in refining sugar, acrylamide is used. So refined white sugar gets to be nice and white and pretty with a process that uses that chemical. Yeah. So very interesting to me that we have so many components of food additives. And again, this one is not an industry added chemical. It's just something that happens in our food, which really begs the question. There's probably a whole lot of other chemicals that we just don't know about that, could be happening. So I think the ultimate takeaway is there's some things that are just not going to be in our control. We still have to eat. We still have to go outside and breathe. We know that the oxygen and the environment will have an impact on our health. So we can't control everything. And that's why I always love it when we can focus on the things that we can control. And whenever we build that anti-cancer way of life, part of that is our nutrition. But what's the other parts? Yeah. And so we can worry ourselves to death, but we know that nutrition is going to be a big part of it. And of course, keeping your body fit, so exercise. And while we know that oxygen in your body is actually causing free radicals, right? Whenever we breathe, we're causing free radicals. So we know that things that we eat are built to help us not only fuel the activity, but also help to mitigate some of the breakdown of our tissues. From the time we're born to the time we die, we're constantly breaking down. So we can't worry so much that we are frozen in our tracks, because really anti-stress, so low stress, becomes such a value in this whole process. And again, when we get exercise and nutrition, it helps with this. We've talked so much about how important our gut is in helping us not be stressed. And so again, this great feedback loop. And even when we're thinking about chemicals in our foods, yes, we can reduce our exposure. So there's some things that we can control and some things that we can't. So the carcinogens are going to be the one that we have some control over. And then, we think of, when do we get to have social engagement and intellectual? We want to make sure that all these pieces fall into place so that we have as much well-rounded joy. And, again, acrylamide is one of those things that hasn't even made it really across too many other states, because in California, they're so worked up about a chemical that we have some control over. But I would much rather the litigators be promoting exercise, healthy foods, rather than a chemical that's sort of hard to understand and let alone identify how much is a safe and adequate intake. And so really what I hope our takeaway is that keep cooking at home, grow a garden if you can. Even though frozen foods are better than canned, there are some cases where frozen foods are going to probably not be the best choice if they're encased in breading, if they're encased in sugar and breading, if meats are pre-marinated in some kind of sugary product, because again, that's going to increase our exposure. Okay? All right. That is acrylamide. We were going to go through a couple more food additives next week, and then we're going to move on to pesticides and herbicides, and that will be full of joy. Thanks so much for joining me today.